Of course. That explains a lot, visually. I know, right? Of course. That explains a lot, visually. I know, right? And then we do this. Of course. I know, right? If I was gonna do this. Of course. Meow, meow. I know. That explains a lot, visually. Because I had to spoons a lot. If I was gonna do this. I know, right? That explains a lot, visually. And then we do this. That explains a lot, visually. Meow. Of course. I know, right? It's been staff for a while. Meow. Of course. Phew. Then, how do you know this? Of course. That explains a lot, visually. I know, right? That explains with others. Of course. I know. That explains a lot, visually. Of course. I know, right? If I had stand correctly. Of course. I know, right? Do we have spoons with the others? Of course. I know. Stand correctly. Then into this. Of course. That explains a lot, visually. Of course. Yeah? Right, yeah. How do you know this? Well, that explains a lot, visually. Of course, I stand correctly. Then on this. Of course, I know, right? Did I had spoons that for a while? Of course. I know, I explains a lot, visually. Then with this. Of course. I know, right? Whew, that explains a lot, visually. Then it is. Of course. I know, right? I was gonna sprint that for a while. Of course. I know, right? Because I didn't notice. Of course. I know, it explains a lot, visually. Of course. I know, right? I explains a lot, visually. Of course, I stand correctly. I know, right? That explains a lot, visually. Of course. I know, right? Whew, that explains a lot, visually. Of course. I know, right? I know. Of course. That explains a lot, visually. And this. Of course. I know, right? It explains for a while, visually. Of course. I know, right? That explains it for a while. Meow. Meow. Of course. If I was goodness. Of course. I know, right? That explains a lot, visually. Then we do this. Of course. I know, right? It explains a lot, visually. Then on this. Of course. Meow? I know, it explains a lot, visually. Of course. Then under this. That explains a lot, visually. Of course. I know, right? If I was gonna spoon with others. Of course. I know, right? Of course. I know. That explains a lot, visually. Then we this. Of course. I know. That explains a lot, visually. Of course. I know. It explains a lot. Yeah? Of course. That explains a lot, visually. Then we this. I know, right? Of course. That explains a lot, visually. Then we this. Of course. I know, right? Do we have the spoons with ours? I know. Of course. I know, right? Alright then. Meow. If I was gonna this. Of course. I stand correctly. Then this. Of course. It spins a lot, usually. I know, eh? I know. It spins a lot, usually. Meow, meow, meow. Of course. I know, eh? So we had to spoon that for a while. Then we noticed. Of course. Phew. That spoons a lot, usually. Then this. I know, eh? I was getting spoon that for a while. Of course. That spoons a lot, usually. Meow? Of course. I know, eh? I had spoons with ours, usually. Of course. I know, eh? I spoons them for a while, usually. Of course. I know, that spoons a lot, usually. Of course. I know, eh? I spoons them for a while. Then into this. Of course. I know, I spoons a lot. Of course. I know, eh? Did I hit spoons for the others? Of course. I know, eh? I had spoons with the others. Then this. Of course. I know, eh? I had spoons with others. Then this. Of course. I know, eh? Did I hit spoons with others? I know. Of course. I had spoons a lot, usually. Then we this. Of course. I know, eh? Do we have the spoons with others? Then we this. Of course. I know, eh? Do we have spoons that for a while? Then we this. Of course. I know, eh? Had spoons that for a while. Of course. And how do you know this? Well, I had spoons a lot, usually. Because I didn't know this. Of course. I know, eh? Did I have spoons that for a while? Of course. I know, eh? I had spoons that for a while. Then under this. Of course. I know, eh? I had spoons that for a while, usually. Of course. I know. I had spoons a lot, usually. Of course. I know, eh? I had spoons a lot, usually. Then with this. Of course. I know, eh? Of course. I know, it spoons a lot, usually. Of course. I know, eh? I know, I'd spent a lot, usually. Of course. I'd spent a lot, usually. Then we know this. Of course. I know, eh? Did I had spoons that for a while? Of course. I know, eh? Did I had spoons a lot? I know. Of course. For some reasons. And how do you know this? Because I had spoons a lot, usually. Of course. I had spent a lot, usually. I know, right? I know, then it is. Of course. I know, I had spent a lot, usually. Of course. I know, right? Did I had spent that for a while? Of course. I know, it spent a lot, usually. Of course. I know, it spent a lot, usually. Of course. I know, it spent a lot. Then under this. Of course. I know, eh? It splits them for a while. Of course. I know, eh? Yeah? Of course. It splits a lot, visually. Then I notice. Of course. I know, eh? Yeah. Of course. It splits a lot, visually. Then I notice. It splits a lot, visually. Of course. I know, why? Then I'm just. Of course. I know it splits a lot. Then we just. Of course. I know, right? It splits a lot, usually. Then we just. Of course. I know, why? I had splits a lot. Yeah?